everyone. Thank you for listening to the Complex Trauma Recovery Podcast. My name is Kina, and I'm super excited to have a guest with me today. My friend Janel, who I have been following on TikTok for a while now and really learning a lot from her content. So I'm super excited to have her on the show. So I am going to read her bio real quick and then have her introduce herself. Before I get started, this episode is going to have a content warning for discussions of suicide. Janel is a suicidologist and specializes in working with people who are suicidal or have struggled with being suicidal. So we're going to be talking about those issues, and it could be potentially triggering. So please just keep that in mind when you are deciding if you want to listen to this episode. Janel Cubbage is a psychotherapist in private practice specializing in trauma and PTSD. She has an eclectic approach to therapy, utilizing EMDR, internal family systems, and somatic therapies to help facilitate healing. Janel earned her master's in clinical mental health counseling from McDaniel College in 2016 and has clinical experience with adolescents in residential settings as well as incarcerated adults. Janel also works as a suicidologist and is currently appointed as the chair of the Governor's Commission on Suicide Prevention. She was awarded a fellowship in 2019 from the Bloomberg American Health Initiative to pursue her master's in public health with a specialization in violence prevention. So thank you so much for coming and being my guest today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited. I love talking about suicide, which probably sounds morbid, but it is an area and a topic that I'm really passionate about, as is trauma.
Yeah, probably I was going to say no more morbid than me saying how much I love talking about trauma and abuse, right? Someone's got to talk about it. Cool. So maybe we can just start with you talking a little bit more about your specialization and what kind of work you do. What does it mean to be a suicidologist?
So to be a suicidologist, I studied suicide. So I studied the causes of suicide, or I actually tried not to say the word causes, but contributing factors to suicide, protective factors, risk factors, proximal and distal warning signs for suicide. I analyze systems to help understand if there are any gaps that we need to address and make recommendations towards. And I just hopefully contribute to the literature. I'm very interested in how suicide impacts minoritized communities. So in 2020, I co-authored a paper that was published in JAMA Psych about the disparate impacts of suicide on Black Marylanders early on in the pandemic. So my contribution to the field moving forward is likely going to be more specific to racism and suicide and that intersection.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, so you kind of look at the intersection of suicidality and trauma and PTSD, and then like racism and social issues that contribute to those experiences.
Yes, trauma and suicide prevention are social justice issues. So all of my work incorporates social justice.
I love that. Okay, can you talk a little bit more about what that means for people that might be a little bit confused about that? Like, how are trauma and PTSD and suicide social justice issues, and what does that mean for you?
A lot of social justice issues, all social justice issues, have to do with human rights and the minoritization of certain communities. So minoritization is not necessarily speaking to groups that are numerical minorities. When we talk about minoritization, we're talking about groups that have been identified as an other in society, and they're intentionally excluded from holding positions of power and also intentionally excluded from receiving certain resources, privileges, etc., that society receives and experiences. So we see minoritization with communities that are people of the global majority, otherwise referred to as people of color. We also see that with individuals who are LGBTQ. Women, to an extent, are minoritized. So that is important, and we can't unwed that minoritization from any of the work that we do. So that minoritization is upheld by systems, all of the systems that we interact with in our day to day. So those become social justice issues. How do we achieve equity and justice for people who have been minoritized and pushed to the fringe and margins of our society? So therapy is no different. Therapy is political because the systems that my clients interact with have caused many of them trauma. And the same is with suicide prevention. When we look at a lot of the contributing factors to suicide and ways that we can reduce suicide, a lot of them are tied to human rights and social justice, marriage equality, using people's correct pronouns, gender affirming care, culturally affirming care, having a livable wage, having affordable housing, things of that nature. Those are all social justice issues and human rights issues, and they really cannot be separated from the work that we do. So I like to embody that in all of my approaches.
Yeah. We tend to, or at least kind of like Western mental health tends to veer towards this like individualizing, pathologizing thing where it's like, well, if someone is depressed or someone is suicidal or someone is addicted or like whatever the mental health issue may be, then like that rests solely in their own mind and on their own like individual issues. And we know that that's not true, you know, especially from all of the research that shows that these risk factors contribute to all these different mental health issues. So I know that, you know, living in poverty increases a lot of the risk factors for those different mental health issues. And I would presume that being in like how do you pronounce it? Minoritized, is that right? Okay, minoritized. I haven't heard it phrased quite like that before. So people in minoritized groups, I'm assuming, tend to experience like higher rates of risk for being suicidal or for depression. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So people who are LGBTQ have one of the highest disparate impacts with suicidal ideation, attempts, and deaths. But it's hard to collect data on that other than through surveys, because that's not information that we collect on death certificates. So unless there's a survey done or a fatality review process, it's really hard to have solid data on what the true impact is in those communities. Historically, in the Black community, researchers have thought that there was some protective mechanism that was keeping the rate of suicide among Black people lower than it was to their white counterparts. I really question whether that was the case. We're actually seeing that change. The rate among Black youth is increasing steadily and quickly, more quickly than any other racial group of the same age range.
Wow.
So I think that there's a lot of kind of racist stereotypes that might contribute to those presumptions, like the strong Black woman stereotype. I think that stigma plays a role in that. And we also have to look at other factors impacting the Black community, especially Black youth, like homicide. So the disparate impact of homicide on Black youth can kind of skew our numbers with other causes of death and make it seem like a smaller issue than it really is.
Yeah.
So we see that it appears lower sometimes when you're looking at data for when you're comparing racial and ethnic groups in terms of suicide. But you kind of have to look deeper for it. So in 2019, nationally, we experienced the first decrease in the suicide rate in 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So people, I'm not very excited about it.
So does that mean that it had just been steadily going up for 19 years consecutively?
It has been, yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like a very good thing. That seems pretty alarming.
It is alarming. The reason I'm not excited about the decrease is when I actually look deeper at the data. So when I looked at the data broken down by racial and ethnic groups, the decrease was pretty much exclusively experienced among white Americans. So every
Mm.
other racial group experienced an increase in suicide deaths. The unknown category did experience a decrease, but it was 15 between years, which is not significant, talking from a statistical perspective.
Right.
So, even though we collectively as a nation experienced a decrease in our suicide rate, we collectively as a nation did not experience a decrease in suicide rates.
Right.
So I think that's also another issue and kind of misnomer when looking at these issues, especially from a social justice perspective, is the way that we look at data, and our internal biases can influence that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, in terms of approaching these issues of suicide and suicide rates from a social justice perspective and also a trauma-informed perspective, I know we talked a little bit about how, being trauma-informed and social justice are very connected because people are traumatized by systems of oppression like racism and homophobia and different things like that. But for you as a clinician, kind of from a clinical standpoint, what does it mean for you to work with the issue of suicidality from a trauma-informed perspective? And kind of with your specialization in trauma and PTSD, how does that connect to your focus on suicide?
So, suicide is something that I expect to be present more often than not in my clinical work, just because of the link between suicidality and having experienced trauma. And I can talk a little bit more about, you know, my thoughts on why experiencing trauma can increase risk for suicide, in addition to some of the well established reasons for that.
Yeah.
Um, so, one, I go in with that expectation that there is probably a greater likelihood than not that my client is thinking about suicide, will think about suicide during the course of our work together, or has in the past, or has had a suicide attempt. Um, that causes a lot of anxiety and fear for clinicians, I think. Which I'm not going to go on that rant and tirade, but so one, having that assumption. Two, also recognizing and thinking about the systems that they've probably touched, and if they do have those experiences, how those systems probably created trauma for them around this issue of suicidality. So there's this notion that, if you tell a therapist you're thinking about suicide, that they're automatically going to send you to the emergency department or call the police on you. And I think that is true for some therapists that aren't well trained and aren't well prepared to handle this clinical issue.
Yeah.
And they inadvertently cause trauma by doing
Right.
that.
Yeah.
So being aware of that and how that trauma and those traumatic experiences contribute to their willingness to, disclose about suicidal ideation and such to you. The experience at the hospital can also be traumatizing. That varies, obviously, it's an individual experience, but, you know, thinking about going to a place and being there for 3 days and, being cut off from your support network, and you don't know the people there, it can produce trauma for
Yeah.
people. So being mindful of that and always thinking about that in terms of planning when a crisis presents, of how can I help this person stay safe in the least restrictive environment and the least traumatic environment,
Yeah.
is really important. There's also the trauma of lived experience. So if someone's had a suicide attempt, that in and of itself is traumatic.
Yeah.
If someone knows someone who's attempted suicide or died by suicide, that's a very traumatic loss as well. So keeping that in mind and just kind of thinking about how all of these factors are intersecting with one another,
Yeah.
and how that impacts the way that my client shows up in the therapy room with me, and how that impacts their ability to trust me,
Yeah.
are all things that I take into consideration. The other thing that I think is really key with being trauma informed and also responding to suicidality is giving clients the autonomy over what happens. You know, I always approach that from a collaborative framework. If a client discloses to me that they're thinking about suicide, my first step is not, okay, I'm going to do this assessment to see what your risk level is. My response is, tell me what's going on, like
Yeah.
what's contributing to you feeling this way, and talking through that and hearing their story.
Yeah.
Um, and then, you know, posing to them at some point, you know, what would be helpful to you in this moment? Do you want to keep talking? Do you want to move on to developing a safety plan? We can talk about you going to a walk-in crisis center or an emergency department if you feel like it would be helpful to you to have further evaluation. So even though I'm presenting um, those three options, I'm still presenting them with options about
Right.
what happens.
Yeah.
And in doing so, I'm still ensuring that we're working towards maintaining their safety, but I'm giving them, you know, the opportunity and the ability to dictate how that looks for them.
Right. Yeah. It's more agency and empowerment focused, which, hearing you talk about that, I was thinking about how just having a space where a client feels safe to like explore the way that they are feeling and thinking without that fear of being immediately like having the police called or having an ambulance called or whatever. I think probably that must feel like a big relief to a lot of people, because I've also seen a lot of people talk about that kind of like compounded trauma where because of past experiences with like, well, I disclosed that I was feeling suicidal to a therapist, and then it led to this like chain of events of these secondary traumas with being, hospitalized or, having all these like other things happen that maybe weren't really in my agency, or like I didn't feel empowered to make decisions during that experience. It makes it really hard to disclose, like you said. And I've seen a lot of people online talk about like, that fear of like not wanting to say the wrong thing or kind of set off the, the silent alarm that's going to lead to these like series of events. So I imagine that that's a pretty impactful benefit for clients, just to have a more like supportive, open environment where it's like you are free to genuinely share how you feel and what you're thinking about, and trust that like your agency and your autonomy isn't just going to be ripped away from you. There's still going to be a process of like collaboration and mutuality and empowerment.
Yeah, and again, I am always thinking about how my response could contribute to existing trauma or create new trauma for someone. And we also have to think about the future, right? Like, not just getting through and keeping them safe through this crisis, but if they were to have suicidal thoughts again, is the way that I'm responding and supporting them in this situation going to lead to them feeling safe enough to disclose again in the future to someone, or is it going to lead to them feeling like they can't disclose to someone in the future? So, keeping that in mind, I think, is also really important. In addition to like giving them that agency and just overall not freaking out, for
Yeah.
a lack of a better term. I think in some aspects, suicidality is part of the human condition, and that many of us will experience suicidality on a spectrum. I think a lot of people don't realize more passive thoughts of suicidal ideation. So yeah, that's kind of my view on things, is really just trying to work collaboratively with them, make sure that they maintain their agency. And, in that approach, I'm very fortunate that I've never had to make a call that took their agency away from them. When we worked collaboratively, we talked about the options and what they felt would be best and most supportive for them. ultimately they followed those recommendations because they had agency over the decision.
Right.
So I'm not at um, the point of needing to call the cops or the ambulance or not allowing them to leave my office. And I hope that I never have to do that.
Yeah.
Um, and the other thing with telehealth, that adds another layer to responding to these situations. If I felt that a client was in danger, and I was seeing them via telehealth, I certainly would not call emergency services and not tell them that they're coming. I've seen stories about that happening, and that's traumatic
Oh,
and
wow.
scary. And I think it can really escalate the situation in a way that's, ultimately not going to result in safety. So,
Yeah. So that's when people are not even told that the cops are being called or that the emergency services are being called, which, yeah, that seems very extra violating to me, because I mean, in my training, it's always been like, I guess I'm thinking more of the example of mandatory reporting with like reporting to child protective services, because that's where a lot of my work experience has been. But we always were trained and would tell our clients, like, don't worry, there's never going to be a surprise report. Like, if anything ever has to be reported, like, you will know ahead of time, you'll be included in the process, because it is super traumatic to have someone that you're working with as like a helping professional, and then for them to make a decision like that and for you to not even be aware that it's happening. So I could see that really messing with people's trust in therapy if they had an experience like that.
exactly. And I think anytime that we have to make those kinds of decisions, like you said, that it shouldn't be a surprise to them. And that's something that I cover in my intake sessions when we talk about limits of confidentiality. I always tell clients, if I ever feel the need that I need to make a mandated report or I need to, break confidentiality to help keep you safe, like I'm going to talk to you about that before I do it. I'm not going to just do it and, you end up with someone at your door or whatever the case may be. So that information and making sure that they're informed of that, I think really goes a long way.
Yeah.
And that's trauma informed,
Right.
it's making sure there aren't undue surprises and undue stress and
Yeah.
anxiety.
Yeah, like that trauma informed practice doesn't just go out the window the second that you're concerned about someone's safety, right? That's probably one of the times that trauma informed practice and informed consent and empowerment are like the most important, so you don't unnecessarily
Absolutely.
re-traumatize someone. Yeah,
Absolutely.
makes sense. Can you talk a little bit more about what you were saying about your ideas about how trauma leads to increased risk for suicide?
Yeah. So, I mean, that relationship between having experienced trauma and that being a risk factor for suicide is well established by research in the literature. Um, so, I think one, like obviously, trauma, you know, impacts our sense of safety and well-being in the world. Our nervous system responding to things can be really overwhelming at times. If nightmares are a part of the symptoms that someone's experiencing from trauma, not even being able to go to sleep, where most of us are able to have our brains turn off and kind of have a respite from the real world. And that really starts to wear on people. But I especially think about the foreshortened future. That is a key feature of trauma. So feeling like you're not going to live very long, you don't have a very long life ahead of you. I think that is something that contributes to um, the likelihood of maybe being involved in community violence, but also with suicide. Because if you feel like you're not going to have a very long life as it is, that can really lead to careless um, behaviors that could put
Mm-hmm.
you in danger. It can lead to hopelessness, if there's not something for you to aspire to. And hopelessness is a big component of suicide. Feeling like there are no options for you left and things are not going to get better. Um, so I think that's definitely one aspect that contributes to that relationship between having experienced trauma and suicide risk.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that contributes to that is, depending on the traumatic experience, a lot of times, those of us who have experienced trauma um, feared for our lives or came close to dying or saw someone who died or was dying. Um, and constant exposure to death can actually decrease our emotional response to it.
Mm.
So it can decrease the fear that we might feel around death. There's an interesting study that showed um, that it was on gun owners, and it showed that the more gun owners had actually like fired their weapon, whether it was at a gun range or whatever, the less afraid they were of death.
Hmm.
Which, if we look at the interpersonal theory of suicide, that posits that um, perceived burdensomeness, thwarted belongingness, and acquiring the capability for suicide kind of come together, and that creates the factors necessary for making a suicide attempt.
Hmm.
And so, if you have foreshortened future, um, you're less fearful of death. Uh, that can, you know, increase someone's capability for
Yeah.
suicide, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. Can you repeat what those two factors were? Was it thwarted sense of belonging, and what was the other one that you mentioned?
Perceived burdensomeness, which
Perceived
I
burden.
think
Yeah.
trauma also creates those
Mm-hmm.
feelings in many people too. So, um, yeah, there's a lot of overlap there between direct impacts of trauma and that model of uh, suicide.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I had thought about with CPTSD specifically and kind of the literature that I've read about CPTSD and suicide, that helplessness and hopelessness are two of the main things that can emerge from CPTSD that can really increase those risks of suicide because, with CPTSD by nature as opposed to PTSD, where you could have PTSD from one standout event, like, you witnessed something really scary, you got in a really bad car crash, like whatever. But with CPTSD by nature, it was recurring and ongoing and chronic. And so that chronic repeating trauma tends to create really heightened levels of like helplessness and hopelessness. A lot of the times, especially because you really are trapped in the situation or the environment where the trauma is repeating, whether that is children growing up in abusive homes where like there's helplessness and hopelessness that comes from just being a child and not really having the means to escape or protect yourself, or other situations that commonly lead to CPTSD are like being incarcerated, being in domestic violence relationships, and those are both situations where someone feels helpless and trapped, and their mobility, their ability to protect themselves or to kind of like fight back or flee, like fight or flight, are cut off from them. And so that's when you get sometimes like that freeze response where you just feel like helpless and hopeless and like there's nothing that I can really do to change my circumstances. And so I can see from that it makes a lot of sense how those kinds of kind of recurring prolonged traumatic experiences and that feeling of helplessness and not being able to escape would lead to at least suicidal ideation for a lot of people, as kind of, when you don't feel like you have the power to change your circumstances, then maybe that is the only thing that feels like an ability to escape for certain people, right?
Yeah, and the model shows, it's usually shown with circles. So the perceived burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness come together, and that can produce the desire for suicide. And then when the capability for suicide is added to that, that's when the risk is really substantial. And with a lot of the factors or examples that you included, they also speak directly to thwarted belongingness. Um, that underlying message being that I'm alone. So if you're a child growing up in an abusive household, the abuse is generally at the hand of your caregiver, your parent, someone who's supposed to love and protect you. So that is a very lonely experience. our brain does some really interesting things that help us to still be able to bond to those caregivers in those types of situations. But, deep down underneath those protective mechanisms, is there truly a sense of belonging in that family unit with that child? In the example of incarceration, you are very literally being removed from society and
Mm-hmm.
being told that you do not belong in society. And then you have people, um, if you have to go up for parole, that get to make a decision about whether you get to re-enter
Right.
society.
Or if you're a
And
felon and you literally don't have the same rights as other people once you leave, like you're literally separated from a sense of like cultural belonging in that way.
exactly, it's almost like a new caste or a new hierarchy within our society where the message being sent is you are not the same as us, you are not on our level. Um, so really thinking about those underlying messages that are sent from these systems, from actions, I think is really important to consider, as well as that burdensomeness comes in. I feel like, really those things go hand in hand. I can't think of many situations where one would exist without the other. So, in the case of that child who's being abused, a lot of abuse is, well, I provide for your basic needs, which we all know is like the bare minimum
Yeah.
of a caregiver to do.
Right.
Um, but what message that's sending is that you're being a burden to me. You're ungrateful. Look at what I'm providing for you, and that's still not enough. Or if the parent like blames the kid for their stress level again, being told that those things are your fault, send that message that you are a burden. In the case of being incarcerated, a lot of people that are incarcerated feel bad because they feel like they're a burden to their family, either um, because they brought shame on their family in their minds, or they played a key role in the family unit in terms of providing for the family, or being a caregiver, something of that nature, and now they're no longer able to fulfill that role. That can really increase burdensomeness.
Yeah.
A lot of times, the thwarted belongingness, the perceived burdensomeness may not be true, so like those may be um, internal narratives. But, there are also external narratives that contribute to those. Family can blatantly say, you are a burden on me, or, in the case of that caregiver, like, you're stressing me out, you're ungrateful, you're this,
Right.
you're that. So um, I think that's important. And especially in the case of maybe when those things might not be true, um, and I don't even like saying not that they're not true, because they are very true to the person experiencing them.
Right.
But when you're in crisis and you're experiencing that, things look and feel very different than what a person from the outside looking in might see and observe. So I think trauma also contributes to that, because um, even if you do have supports in your life, you can still feel very alone and feel very isolated from them. A lot of times, when we develop those protective mechanisms that only allow us to connect with people to a certain extent, that can feel very lonely. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of ways that trauma intersects with that model in
Yeah.
theory.
And the model, you said that it's called the interpersonal suicide model. Was that what it's called?
The Interpersonal Theory of Suicide by
Okay.
Thomas Joyner.
Okay, yeah, I will have to look that up. So, just to give like a overview of what that model is there like a way that you could paraphrase it, or like I mean, I'm hearing that these main components have to do with people's perceptions of their place in their communities, and the strengths of their relationships and their perception of how they are valued by their communities and by people around them. But maybe there's a better way that you could summarize it for us.
Yeah, so the cliff notes are that if a person is experiencing perceived burdensomeness, so they feel like a burden to those around them, if they have thwarted belongingness, so they feel alone, those two factors can come together and produce the desire for suicide. So, thinking about suicide. And then when capability for suicide is added, so, we talked about that reduced fear of death, foreshortened future, having access to lethal means, all of those things contribute to capability of suicide. So when those three factors come together, that's when the risk substantially increases for a suicide attempt or death.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. And I know that, I mean, the features that you talked about that contribute to that risk are definitely really core features for CPTSD for a lot of people, the feelings of being burdensome. I've talked in other episodes about how that's like a really common result just from neglect, from emotional neglect in the home, because if you have caregivers that consistently do not meet your needs and, are not able to meet your needs, then children tend to internalize that to be like, well, my needs are clearly too much and unmeetable. And like, my feelings are too big and I ask for too much, and like internalize all those messages. And then often that can get like reproduced in other relationships as those children get older and, lead to like abusive or neglectful romantic relationships that kind of like reinforce those narratives, and the feeling of like loneliness and alienation and separation. I can see definitely how for people with CPTSD, the risk of being suicidal could definitely go substantially up, and it just seems like it's a very stigmatized topic in a lot of ways. So I'm glad that, like, I feel like this is just such a good conversation to have to kind of reduce some of that stigma, because like you were saying, even within therapy, people sometimes feel that stigma of like, I don't know if I can bring this up, or these bad things are going to happen. And it's like, well, if there's anywhere that we should be able to bring it up, it's in therapy. But people have that like fear, of these different consequences. So I think people even like admitting that they're struggling with suicidal ideation can be really challenging because of the like you said, the freaking out response, that they might get not just from therapists, but just from friends and family. I mean, and it's understandable because for people without the training in it, it's a scary thing to hear, of course, like it's scary to hear that someone that you love is thinking about killing themselves. But I think we need to be able to like have that dialogue in a more open way in order to reduce, the risk of people actually going through with suicidal ideation. Because I imagine that kind of like, oh my God, reaction really reduces people's ability to like speak about this and get the help that they need.
Yeah, and I think also, a mindset shift is needed of not, when someone discloses to you that they're thinking about suicide, like not thinking, oh my gosh, they're going to kill themselves. Think about the fact that they're sharing that with you. That's a positive thing, that they're reaching out to you, they're trying to talk to you about it. That's a good thing. That's positive. Um, the other thing that I've seen that happens in those situations a lot is that people attempt to shame them, which it's not a useful tactic. And that can be really re-traumatizing for someone with CPTSD that already has so much shame around their experiences and their very existence.
Mm-hmm.
What about your family? Think about your family. How are they going to feel? Um, the other issue with that, besides being very shameful and unsupportive, is in most cases, they have people thinking about suicide think that their family and loved ones would be better off with them. Again, we have to remember that they feel like a burden to those around them.
Right.
So, in their minds, them no longer being around would be better for their friends, family, and loved ones.
Right.
So, that's
It's
just
just not
in
really an
general
effective
very
response.
not at all.
Yeah. So, what would you suggest for people listening, about the best way to respond to someone that shares suicidal feelings or ideation with like friends or family?
So I would start off by thanking them for sharing that with you, because it probably took a lot of courage on their end to do that, because of how stigmatized suicide is as a topic, and also that fear of how someone's going to respond. So, thank them for sharing that with you. That's a very vulnerable spot to be in. And then I would just kind of ask them, like, what's going on that's making you feel this way? Hear what's going on for them. I know that your mind is immediately going to jump to, we need to go to the hospital or call a therapist or whatever. Like, you will get there, trust me. But, you know, you are talking to a human. So, stay there and be present with them, and hear about what's been going on in their life that's leading to them feeling that way. And then, after listening to them, be sure to validate them. Don't, I think a lot of times well meaning people will say things, but so and so cares about you, or, you just got that scholarship. Like, things are just beginning for you. You have your whole life ahead. There will be more partners, or whatever the case may be. And they say those things, from a place of good faith. They mean well, but it's invalidating the person and how they feel. So just being mindful about how you do respond when they are sharing with you the things that they're going through. And then, you can let them know, hey, I'm so happy that you shared all of this with me. This is really beyond, my training and my ability to help keep you safe. I think it would be really helpful if we could get you connected with someone who does know how to respond to these situations,
Yeah.
and then talk to them about what those options are. That, I would say, is like the gold standard of of responding to someone who's thinking about suicide.
Yeah. Yeah. So just validating and not like arguing with them or guilt tripping them or going like immediate crisis alarm mode and just kind of holding space and empathizing, it sounds like.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times when people hear that, they see their role as having to convince the person why they need to stay alive. And that's not really your role in that moment. That person will identify those things uh, a lot of times through talking and telling their story. Um, and even if we point those things out, that's not necessarily effective, because that might not feel true to them in
Right.
those moments.
Yeah.
So,
And I've heard that in general, it's a lot more effective if someone actually comes up with their own reasons and their own motivations for, why they're choosing to get help or to stay alive, rather than have those reasons kind of like projected onto them. Like, well, what about, your mom or your sister or whatever?
yeah. And I think that, again, those things create a lot of shame when we try to come up with those things for someone, because then it's like, okay, they're telling me that I should want to be alive because of my caregiver, my parent. But my caregiver and parent was my abuser. But now I feel ashamed that I don't feel that way towards that person. So we have to be really careful and mindful of people's experiences, even if they haven't disclosed that to us. And again,
Yeah.
I think that goes back to the principles of being trauma informed.
Yeah.
Just going into these situations knowing that this person has likely experienced trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. That all makes sense. I think my last question for tonight is, what are the changes that you would like to see in the mental health field regarding how suicide and people that are suicidal are, talked about and treated, and the services that they receive? You talked a little bit about some of the cultural shifts that you'd like to see in terms of, addressing the systemic and political issues that are contributing to people's mental health. And I know you mentioned at the beginning of the interview that a lot of therapists are not really adequately trained on how to handle someone that is suicidal without kind of immediately like escalating to calling police or crisis services. But yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about like what kinds of shifts you envision in mental health in the future with this.
So, one, programs need to have a course on suicide that is a core component of the curriculum. Um, Two, they need to stop teaching suicide as a legal and ethical issue and address it as a clinical one. Yes, of course, suicide is still an ethical issue. We have ethical responsibilities there, but only teaching it as a primarily legal and ethical issue contributes to a lot of the anxiety that clinicians feel around
Yeah,
suicide.
yeah.
And it does not prepare them for responding to these situations at all. Which ironically is what would help you fulfill your legal and ethical obligations in that situation.
Right.
It's a very interesting conundrum.
Yeah.
Um, So I think that starts with the programs. I think licensing boards should require a certain number of continuing education credits that are related to suicide for licensure renewal. Um, I really want to see clinicians challenge themselves and think about, you know, ask yourself, if you've had an experience where a client has disclosed to you that they're suicidal, and reflect on that experience and what came up for you in that experience. And if you haven't had that experience, think about truly, if a client came to you and told you that they were suicidal, sit and notice, what's going on in your body, what's coming up for you, and what is that related to? Is that related to a fear that you need to protect yourself so that you don't get sued? Is that related to feelings of inadequacy and incompetence because your program didn't prepare you for how to respond to these situations? Is it bringing up personal experiences that you have had, either yourself or maybe a friend or a loved one? Really sitting with that and thinking and working through any biases that they might be holding. There's a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes around suicide, like people are attention seeking. If they tell me they're not serious, really doing that internal work and exploring what biases that you're holding that are interfering with your ability to work with people who are experiencing suicidal ideation. I would say that those are the biggest shifts that I think need to happen, in addition to, which kind of speaks to the previous examples, clinicians being comfortable responding clinically to this and creating an environment and atmosphere where clients feel comfortable and safe disclosing this. And when I'm talking about clinicians feeling comfortable and confident, I'm not saying that you're not going to be anxious. I still
Sure.
get anxious feeling this way. Of course, it's nerve-wracking. It's a great sense of responsibility. You don't want to see this person, die. That is a normal response. You should feel anxiety around that,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
But you should not feel so anxious that you are rendered unable to respond
Right.
in a helpful and supportive manner. So those are the
Yeah.
biggest shifts that I think need to happen.
Yeah, hearing you say that kind of made it click for me that like you're right that the training, at least in my program about suicide, was very much focused on like legal and ethical responsibilities. Like it has a lot to do with like drilling into your head, like this is when you're ethically mandated to make a report, this is when HIPAA no longer applies, or when, when you're there's exemptions from HIPAA in these specific scenarios. It was a very like kind of like logistical legal study, and not nearly as like personal or humanistic or like clinical, like you said, as a lot of the other studies. So that's really interesting, and I can see why that would kind of almost like program into clinicians' heads, like when this issue comes up, you're no longer in clinical mode, you're in like legal, make sure I follow like the letter of the law mode. And that can be like this really big disconnect probably for clients. I'm sure that they can often sense that kind of like jarring, transition from like, I'm in like a clinical connecting to you as a human mindset to like, what are the laws and how do I follow them mindset. I'm sure that you can pick up on that as a client when it's an uncomfortable juxtaposition for a clinician, right?
Absolutely. And especially when you've experienced trauma, we've learned to pick up on all of these cues to sense, if we're safe and things of that nature. So, you know, having those heightened senses is even more reason why clinicians need to find a sense of comfort with dealing with these things. And again, you know, the majority of us are going to have some sort of experience with suicidal ideation, even if it's on the passive end. So you have likely already worked with clients who were suicidal, and you're likely to encounter them in the future in your clinical work. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when,
Yeah.
and will you be prepared?
Yeah, totally. Well said. Cool. Well, I think those are all my questions that I have. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm glad we finally got to do this interview. I've been meaning to do it for a while. So I'm really glad I got to pick your brain about this. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
I will link to Janelle's social media and where you can find her work in the bio of this episode for anyone that wants to go check her page out.